They came for the land before dawn, wagons already packed when Morningstar woke to the sour tang of fear in the air. She kept her eyes closed a long moment longer, listening to the creak of boards, the muffled curses of men who thought the revolution of their own law made them masters of other people's lives. For 3 generations, the Red Hawk Lodge had stood where the river turned, a low cluster of cottonwood and adobe where wind carried the old songs. Her father had taught her which roots would steady a fever, which leaves would make a poultice, how to stitch a woman back from the edge when a baby would not breathe. The land held the bones and stories of her people and the medicines that had saved them. Now it was slated to be swept clean by a paper signed in a distant office. Morning Star, 40 winters felt in her back and hands, pushed aside the blanket, and rose. Her hair was braided close to keep the cold off the nape of her neck. Tonight it had been loose, the way she slept when grief allowed. She had been widowed twice, once by fever that took her first husband in the long, greedy weeks when doctors had called it an inconvenience and not a threat, once by a man who had come with promises too heavy for his heart and left with the town's easy cruelty. She had learned not to let men make the maps of her life. Her skill with herbs and bones, with the ledger that recorded who owed whom and what seed would be needed in spring, that was her sovereignty. The notice pinned to the doorway had the neat stamped letters of the federal agent. For the good of the people, they wrote. They were ordering the removal of families from the valley. The word removal tasted like ash to anyone who'd known the slow drying of a riverbed. Morningstar had packed small things for 3 weeks now. Jars of salves, her medicine pouch tied with red sinew, a few embroidered shirts belonging to the women who came to her so often. She had the stubbornness of a woman who knew what the seasons meant and would not hand that knowledge to the next hand-turned sheriff. Around her, the other women moved like wind through the rooms. Rosa, a widowed baker with hands flour-dusted from years of kneading, tightened the straps on her little girl's shoes. Mary, a school teacher who had come west with a trunk of books and a jaw of iron, folded a picture of a town boy who'd left and not returned. Old Cora, a Comanche aunt who had taught Morningstar the old songs, sat at the kitchen table and wrapped her fingers around a clay mug until the heat burned the skin white. It was not just land they risked losing. It was the continuity of lives stitched to the soil. They had come for Morningstar the way vultures scent a carcass, with forms of law and legalese. She could stand in the square and argue until her voice rasped raw, but the men in suits held the paper and the law held the gun. She had stood before them once, when they tried to claim the saplings she'd planted as minnable timber, when they claimed the spring on the North Bend belonged to the county, and she had walked away with threats and a sense that unearned rules, pressed with authority, could be as sharp as a bullet. Inside, the medicine bundle lay like a sleeping thing on her table, bundles of dried roots, rattlesnake rattle tied by a string, a strip of buckskin with beadwork that told stories no white man could read. Morningstar's hands hovered over it. She felt small rage build, not the kind that scatters into drunken nights, but the calm, icy clarity of a woman who knows what she must protect. The law wanted to take her land. The law wanted to take her voice. The law wanted to decide where she and her people would live. She would not let them pick up her remedy jars and carry them away with a cart. It was then, in that sharpening hour of a winter closing in, that the outlaw arrived. He stumbled into the yard as if the wind had pushed him by the scruff. A snake of white foam clung to a man's jaw, and his pant leg had been opened by something that had a hunger. Morningstar's eyes narrowed not with curiosity, but with a clinician's assessment. Rattlesnake, likely western diamondback, bite too low, swelling spreading with a heat that spelled infection. He sank down by the well, his breath sharp and shallow as if drawing from a throat full of dust. "You should be at the road," Rosa said, because the road meant their captors and the wagon with the agent's name. "Why hide here?" He laughed, a sound fractured by pain. "Because your yard has a spring and I knew a woman's hands would be better than a doctor in town who'd bill me for every breath." The outlaw's face was wind-hard and sun-blackened. His name was Silas Kane, a man who'd been whispered about in train stops and saloons as the one who took without asking, who had a rope of accusations trailing behind him. Morningstar had seen men like him before, mercenaries of circumstance, men who lived on the seams of society. She did not trust him on sight, but she did not refuse a hurt person. Her oath to the old ways and to the living made the choice before she had time to think about the consequences. The world may have labeled him an outlaw, but the venom in his leg was indifferent to labels. She rolled up her sleeves and moved with the surety of someone who had stitched bones and brewed the fever into sleep more times than she could count. Morningstar laid a compress to the bitten area and murmured in a language older than the county ledgers. The words were not magic, not in the way of miracles. They were directions and attention, the kind of care that chased venom to the edges and set the body to work again. She knew ligatures were dangerous, knew when to make an incision and when to let heat draw the blood. Her hands smelled of sage and iron, Her fingers worked with a competence that stole the breath of the watching women. Silas watched her while the songs were old as rivers and younger than the crease in the county's new law. He watched the way Morningstar's jaw tightened as the swelling rose, the way her voice softened when she guided him to breathe. He found himself thinking, absurdly and without permission, that this woman would not beg. He liked that. It was a small observation, but it lodged like a splinter. When the immediate danger passed and the pulse became steadier, Silas's gaze stayed on Morningstar. For once, he was not the singer of saloon tales, but a man whose body needed her competence. He said in a voice that tried to be unremarkable, "You saved me. Your choice," she said. She did not accept debt in words. She accepted actions as the currency she trusted. Now you leave before the wagon masters decide to make an example of anyone who helps an outlaw. He expected her to spit him out with the next harsh wind. Instead, she folded a boiled cloth and tied his wound. She fed him broth. She watched him sleep. Outside, the hired men readied their wagons and their paperwork. Inside, Morningstar looked at the map of her life and began to draw a line she had not planned for. Not flight this time, but a plan. If the law would take her land by the next moon, then staying and fighting meant risking the women in her care. Leaving meant betraying the roots that held their stories. Neither option sat comfortably like a shoe fitting a toe swollen from frost. She set a small clay bowl beside Silas's hand. "When you stand," she said, "you stand by your own feet. No debts owed in words. If you help others as I do, then maybe the ledger will even." There was no charity in that. There was a stark arrangement. He had offered his body to the mercy of her knowledge. Now she made him choose what to do with that life. Outside, the wagon's wheels bit into the earth like teeth. Morningstar listened to the sounds and felt the weight of decisions pressing down like a winter sky. She was no longer simply a woman in crisis. She was a woman with a line to draw, and she would draw it with care, with knowledge, with the stubborn patience that had kept a people alive through winter famines and white man's laws. Morningstar did not offer Silas a choice in words. She offered him a chance to earn his keep. While the men on the street measured property titles and signatures, she measured the needs of those in her yard, the children with coughs, the women with hands raw from labor, the old who had bled out of savings into the pockets of speculators. She set Silas to work under her watch, first carrying wood, then painting the shelter's battered railing, then, when she found the trust growing like something that took deliberate care, teaching him how to cut and prepare herbs without wasting them. Silas was a quick study. The outlaw's trades had everything to do with movement, with reading terrain and people's habits. He prided himself on knowing when a man lied before the man could make his story neat. Morningstar's medicine had a different logic: patience, exactness, watching the body as one would read a map of a river. He learned to see the signs in the iris of an eye, to smell infection before it announced itself loudly. He found solace in the practical rituals of boiling, drying, tying, and measuring. There, by the boiler and the mortar, he could be useful in ways the law did not name. Their alliance began practical. When the first agent arrived with stamped orders and a fussy clerk who sniffed at the dust of their floors, Morningstar met him with a face that both honored and refused his rights. She had a ledger crusted with evidence, years of trade, a contract dated in the name of a dead relative, a mortgage that had been misapplied by a town marshal who trusted his own appetite for profit more than the rights of people. She knew the law's language well enough to make a case for time, not victory, but delay. She had spoken to attorneys in the past, translated for poor women who had no voice in the county office. The men with printed paper had the arrogance of a thing that never understood what it was to be rooted. Silas, for all his outlaw reputation, became both her muscle and her shadow when threats turned toward the physical. When a deputy tried to pry open the medicine chest with greedy fingers, Silas stepped in with calm that had the force of a storm. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. His presence was a statement. A body that had been saved by her hands would now stand to protect her choice to stay whole. He never claimed to be her savior. He refused the idea with a flatness that impressed her. "I was saved. I'll save what I can. I won't speak for you." The trust between them sprouted from small things: a share of bread broken at midnight, a conversation under stars about how people wore grief different on their faces. Morningstar's alley eye for detail noticed the scar that ran from Silas's temple down his cheek, the scar of a bullet he had never talked about. When she asked, he deflected with a joke. But when Rosa's oven fell ill and the bread would not rise, Morningstar sent Silas into the town to buy yeast, and as he returned, he diverted the deputy's attention long enough to whisper, "I know a man who owes me a favor. He'll stall them." She did not romanticize his past. She did not need to. The stories people told about Silas were messy. He had been blamed for robberies that had profit in them, and for acts he had committed in desperation. He had never shown up to take credit, only to take what needed taking when life pegged him to the edge. In the eyes of the women who gathered around the stove, he was a useful complication. In the ledger Morning Star kept in her head, he fit as a necessary line, a living, breathing variable in a plan she had not let herself fully map out until necessity demanded that she do so. Their escapes and survivals were not the stuff of cinematic flight, but the careful orchestration of two people who respected the other's craft. He knew tracks the men who came with warrants could not see. Morning Star knew which plants defied drying and which songs unsettled restless children enough to sleep. Once, when the county men tried to seize a crate of seed meant for spring planting and insisted it was contraband, Silas staged a diversion by setting alight a trap of old hay across the other side of town. The men ran, and Morning Star and the other women moved the seeds to safety. She watched him from the lull of the feed room as the smoke swallowed the twilight and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the shape of survival might be larger than fear. They escaped suspicion together like a pair of animals learning to share a watering hole. She was not a woman waiting to be saved. She was a woman who made the decision to accept an alliance based on pragmatic honor. He was not a knight who had come to claim her. He was a man whose freedom was entangled with her own. He paid his debt to the land every day with sweat, and she paid hers with cleverness, with the medicine that soothed broken men and women back to usability. The trust was mutual. He learned the discipline of patience from herb cutting and calendaring doses. She learned the strategy of watching how men who had always thought themselves clever could be outwitted with a noise, a smoke, a borrowed favor. Morning Star had not sought an outlaw. She had sought safety, an extension of the thin margin on which her life hung. The outsider who had been bitten by a rattlesnake would remain, not because of pity, but because he had proven that he could be useful to the woman she was trying to become. He respected her choices precisely because she offered choices instead of supplications. When the county threatened eviction again, he sat by her side and said, "If they touch you, we run. If we run, we take the women and the old and the children. If we fight, we do it on your call." That statement, that the choice would be hers, settled like a warm stone between them. It was the foundation of an unlikely alliance built not on romance at first, but on sovereignty and mutual competence. Weeks had a way of lengthening into the next thing when Morning Star worked. There were mornings when grief sat like a low cloud above the ridge, and the memory of what had been stolen, a husband, a safe night, years of slow savings, pressed into her lungs. There were afternoons when she found herself moving like a woman who could not stop, her hands busy with tasks that made pain manageable. Strength does not announce itself like a new dress. It accrues in calluses, in the way a person breathes after a run, in the way someone trusts their steps on a path they have built. Morning Star's transformation was that slow accretion. She found, with precise and hungry pleasure, that she could plan for things beyond the immediate night. The hideout they made behind the adobe, if hideout gave too romantic a sheen to a place of pragmatic refuge, became a space where she taught and learned. She taught a handful of women how to smoke meat properly so it would last through an uncertain spring, where to plant marigolds to keep root-eating insects from the potatoes, and which concoction would silence a child's fever for a day and not harm the liver. She taught Silas to recognize the subtle color in the marrow that meant infection, and because he was a good learner, he taught himself to keep his hands clean before and after treatments, a small thing that saved many lives in the weeks that came. Within, she made room for the kind of healing that is not measured by poultices. They sat at night and spoke as women do, of stifled hopes and stubborn griefs, of the husband who never came back, of the sister whose papers had been lost or sold by a man with no decency. Rosa, Mary, and old Cora shared bread and rumor and the ways of wounding that needed more than medicine. There was a queer tenderness in that circle, not sexual necessarily, but a soft solidarity the county's notices had not accounted for. Morning Star's authority grew not by decree but by competence, and by the way her voice took on the even, low timbre of a woman who had been forced to make decisions and found she could. She began making decisions about the future. She sat with the ledger again and sketched a plan. If the reservation was inevitable by law's current course, then she would not die under its fence. She would take the medicine knowledge, the seed stock, the women's trust, and find a place that would allow them to practice their skills. "We will not be buried under a paper we did not sign," she told them the night of the first snow. "We will take our work where it's needed and where we can keep it safe." Silas, whose competence had been repurposed into day work and watching, began to show a steadier hand in the small things that had once been only his wild scrapping. He taught some of the younger men in the hideout how to patch a saddle without leaving a flaw that would split under a heavy load. He dug latrine pits with the thoroughness of a man who knew the cost of sloppiness. But the thing that changed him most was the lightness in his step when Morningstar asked his opinion and then did what she had decided regardless. He was unaccustomed to an equality that did not try to domesticate his past. The partnership's romantic pulse flickered quietly into something softer and more complicated. On a cold evening, beneath a sky that felt like a bowl of black enamel spattered with white, Silas sat across from Morningstar and offered the rest of a tobacco roll he had saved. "I used to think I was owed a life," he said slowly, as if some bones needed setting. "Taken from the town, the trains, the houses, but the world keeps taking, doesn't it? You make things fixed. You put the pieces back in order so people can stand." She looked at him. In the embers of the fire, a child's face made sharp with sleep and worry. Morningstar's expression softened, then tightened with the moral clarity of her view. "I don't fix people," she said. "I teach them to be less broken." It wasn't romantic in the flowery sense. It was recognition of agency. He wanted to be less broken. He wanted to be useful in a way that did not leave him empty at the end of the day. In the small victories, her confidence grew. She petitioned the agent a second time, not with pleading, but with a paper trail she had spent weeks assembling. Receipts for the seeds, signatures from women who could testify to her work as a healer, even a lease drawn up in the name of a joint cooperative of women that would run the midwife service and bake bread for the town. The agent looked long at the neat script and then at her face, and saw that the woman was not just a name on a ledger, but someone with a network, with men and women who would act on behalf of that network. He could not then, without bad optics, simply take everything at once. He could delay, he could threaten, but the moral friction of the ledger made him pause. Stronger still was the moral revolution within her own chest. Morningstar began to consider property with a new vocabulary, not as a thing you clung to until the last breath, but as something mobile, movable when necessary, but to be protected in its use. She began to teach others about how to keep a record, how to share responsibility, how to barter in ways that the men in suits could not easily undo. She traded healing for seed, for a rope of favors, for information. She spun out the web of survival carefully. Her appearance changed in the way a woman carries herself when the carriage she makes is not only for herself. The beadwork she wore at first as a defiance of a lost husband, a small red medallion of her father's, stayed by her heart. But she stopped letting grief hide in shawls and started wearing the aprons that matched the baskets, the patched skirts that bore the paint of a woman who would not be ashamed of work. It was not vanity, it was a proclamation. When she walked into the town, she walked like someone whose life had weight and use. The men who had thought to intimidate her now considered the possibility that she would be hard to break. Silas had a past that read like a docket. Robberies, a jailbreak, a string of grudges. The townsfolk liked the story of him as a sinuous problem that could be corralled, but Morningstar had never been in the business of letting stories speak louder than facts. She listened to him explain, one night over a bowl of broth, what had led him to a life on the run. Poverty first, a family's land taken by a lender who paid with paper and called it law. A brother hung for attempting to take the land back. Then the feed store robbery that started his run. The profits were sold so he could pay for a sister's medicine. By the time the men called him an outlaw, the labels had hard edges he could not get rid of. She did not pity him. She parsed him the way a healer would, what might be healed, what was a scar to be respected. And she recognized the value in his skills, not as a man to be molded, but as tools that could be pressed into service for her cause. He knew the back routes like a cartographer knows continents. He could read the patterns of the agent's days, when the clerk took tea, when the sheriff favored a horse race, when a militia would be drunk and less reliable. His illegal past could become a map of opportunity. He could, in quiet ways, obtain papers, distract the hateful men, and bring the knowledge of how to slip past watchful eyes. This recalibration of his talents did something to him. He had spent so many years outrunning his past, he never learned how to stand and own what he had been. Morningstar's demands were precise. Choose which of his old tricks he would leave behind and which he would refine. She asked him to do the things that required not bravado, but patience and ingenuity. He began to take pride in that. Thieves take joy in the glitter. Silas took joy in the cleverness of a plan that protected women and not a safe's contents. When the county agent started to sell small parcels of the valley to speculators, Silas used his knowledge to track the buyers and the people who would sign at night with ink and greed in their faces. He would linger near taverns and listen for the names of those who liked quick, secret deals. He would then vanish and return with evidence, a note, a name, a ledger entry, that Morningstar could use to disrupt the sales. She never asked him to steal what belonged to a widow. She asked him to retrieve paper that would show the agent's deal a fraud. The outlaw became an intelligence agent for the cause of women who only wanted to keep the seeds they planted. Silas's own redemption arc happened in small proofs. Once, a band of men tried to move a wagon loaded with medicine to another town, claiming it was contraband. Morning Star did not want to confront them in a public melee. She wanted evidence to shame the men and reclaim the goods. Silas rode out at night to intercept the convoy and got himself arrested on purpose, a calculated arrest that let him talk to the transporters up close and gather names. He emerged miraculously with a different story. The men had taken bribes, they had lied, the medicines were returned. Silas tasted, then, that electricity of doing something useful that made the world more fair. It did not absolve all his past. It changed him in that he no longer wanted to be feared. He wanted to be relied upon. Their attraction deepened in an unlikely way, mutual improvement. Morning Star taught him gentleness with patience, how to hold a fevered child without letting the child's panic become his own. He taught her to watch for the small tricks men use to crush a woman's resolve, a lawyer's flattery, a sheriff's false smile. His criminal past gave her ammunition not to fight more bloodily, but to outwit the law's creatures. He deferred to her in moral matters, and she deferred to him on matters of movement. They fit, not like puzzle pieces forced to fit, but like two tools in a hand that learned the other's balance. The world responded. Men who had once thought she was an easy target discovered their mistake. Girls who had seen their mothers take 2 steps back from anything the town demanded now watched a woman who took her fate like a thing to be carved. Morning Star never forgot that Silas's criminal cunning had consequences. He had done wrong. But she also believed in a chosen life, in the idea that the person you had been was not necessarily the person you must remain. He learned under her that dignity did not belong only to those with clean hands, and she learned that redemption was not a story which demanded the losing of oneself. He never begged her forgiveness. He earned trust. When the sheriff's men tried to force a woman into naming allies by threat, it was Silas who intercepted them with printed paper in his pocket, and a false lead that ate up their day. When an agent arrived with a wagon meant to cart away the elderly, Morning Star lured the event into a public town meeting where Silas, with his knowledge of the townsfolk, produced testimony and witnesses who made the eviction look less like lawful enforcement and more like theft. The outlaw's knowledge served her cause. She gave it a moral aim and held him to it. It was a partnership where both were reshaped by the other's demands. The heart of the matter was not only the land, it was the system that had a neat word for dispossession and a rough appetite for convenience. Morning Star said this plainly to the circle of women gathered in the kitchen, as rain began to thread through the roof. "They don't want us here because having us shows them the cost," she said. Her voice was even. It did not tremble with fury, but there was a blade in it that made the women lean in. "They want the land cleared, so speculators can sell tidy lots with white picket fences and pretend no one ever lived on this slope. They want the water controlled and the medicine sold. They're not after our houses. They're after the knowledge we carry that keeps them from needing them." She spoke of a man named Hale, a county official who had a taste for other people's estates. He had bought influence the way others bought drinks, casually and with expectation of profit. He had, Morning Star had learned through careful questioning and shared confidences, been behind a string of dubious transfers and a half-hearted push to roll the Indian families onto the reservation, claiming it was for their own good. The language hid malice beneath benevolence. Morning Star knew the type. The man had used philanthropy to wash his hands of the guilt the land would fight to keep. Beyond Hale was the town's small elite who had a vested interest in seeing Morning Star leave. A new saloon owner, a grain broker, a judge with a habit of taking hostesses for long rides. They had lined their passions with paper. They were the kind of men who thought a woman's resistance was a charming rusticity that would eventually fade. They misjudged her. Morning Star's plan was not simplistic. She wanted more than to keep a roof over her head. She wanted to make it impossible, morally and practically, for them to take everything and pretend it was righteous. She wanted justice that would not merely be revenge, but would reassert the right of women, old and young, to keep their work and their freedom. She wanted a place where her medicines would be taught to new hands, and not cataloged into a drawer with a museum label. This required risk. It required unmasking the deals, tracing the payments, showing the paper trail that ran like a fever through Hale's office and into the pockets of men with too many fronts. Morning Star began to stitch together testimony from women who had been cheated, receipts that had gone missing and been reappeared in the hands of speculators, logs of births and midwives paid in coin never reached. She worked through the night writing affidavits and collecting signatures, balancing the ledger like a priest counting prayers. Every paper she collected was a promise that the truth, once held steady, could unseat even men with legal titles. Silas volunteered to go where others feared. He rode out to the other towns where Hale's partners ran saloons and laundries, and he bought time. He picked pockets of information like folks picking fruit from trees, not for the sugar but for the seeds. He brought back ledgers and receipts, people who had been bought for a price and would talk for a safer one. Morningstar used the papers to create fury in the right places. Not the mob's fury that would give the men of money an excuse to brand them lawless, but a methodical exposure that would force the county's own agents to pay attention. The plan was surgical. Her fury, when it erupted, was controlled. It was a righteous outrage that moved like a river through narrow channels. She petitioned a judge not with temper, but with the slow reenactment of truth. She took her case to a woman sympathetic to their cause who ran the town's small independent press. The press printed their testimonies. When Hale read his name in black ink, his visage, which once had been an impenetrable mask of authority, cracked. Men who had thought themselves cunning were suddenly exposed to the wider world outside their whispering rooms. But the stakes rose. As the truth spread like a slow fire, the men who profited had the power to hurt. The judge threatened to levy fines. The sheriff, under orders, arrested 2 of Morningstar's circle for disorderly gathering when they met to plan. Their goods were seized temporarily, and the women were fined small sums that ate at the week's earnings. The men made it personal with the grotesque comfort of those who have always had the power to punish. Morningstar faced her own temptation, to hand her work to the county and let their justice be the final word. She refused. She had seen how county courts made martyrdom of the dispossessed with the languid strokes of their gavel. Instead, she resolved to expose the system publicly and rebuild as necessary. She made a plan not to annihilate men like Hale, but to render them impotent, to buy back public opinion by proving their malfeasance, and by setting up a real, physical alternative. Her anger gave rise to strategy. She pressed the other women into roles where their talents would shine. Rosa ran the bakery as a place where evidence was gathered under the smog of flour. Mary taught the children, collecting testimonies at the same time, and used the school's reputation to shelter men Silas had brought in for questioning. Cora, old Cora with her songs, used the church's suppers to whisper truths to women who wore corsets tight with fear. The women became a covert orchestra playing to the same song. In the heat of it, when threats escalated, Morningstar had to make hard choices. When the agent threatened to take certain elderly people into a wagon and away to the reservation without due process, she had to decide between a public fight that could cost lives and a gamblier quiet motion that could save them. She chose the quiet motion, moved the elderly under cover of dense fog and Silas's knowledge of the terrain and the timing of the county men's cigarettes, and won. She did it by deciding for herself, by choosing the life over the law when the law would take lives. The choice was not about winning headlines. It was about keeping the hands that baked bread and sang at midnight warm enough to continue tomorrow. The plan to dismantle Hale's interests and protect their survival required a structure that looked less like a band of fugitives and more like a co-op. This was, for Morningstar's mind, a stroke of necessary invention. She petitioned the women to formalize their mutual aid. They would pool resources, register as a cooperative that provided midwifery, herbal medicine, and seed exchange. A thin legal veneer that would make it costlier for the county men to steal their goods without facing the appearance of impropriety. It wasn't perfect protection, but it was a way to assert a kind of property that law would have to recognize to trample. Silas was instrumental. He knew how documents could be faked and how signatures could be forged. Under Morningstar's direction, he taught them the tricks not to pervert law, but to protect their assets. Contracts were written with the same care as a medicine recipe. Every transaction, every favor, every time a woman bartered a midwife visit for a sack of grain, it was written and dated. The paperwork was ordinary and steady, the kind of thing bureaucrats like because it soothed their need for order. Morningstar used that to their advantage. Equal partnership meant the hard work of admitting weaknesses and building each other up. Morningstar revealed the way grief still lodged in her nights, how sometimes she woke and felt the old, husbandless ache and wondered if she had stiffened into a life too brittle for laughter. Silas revealed his dream of a small patch of land, fenced not by barbed wire but by a fence of mutual respect, where he could stop hiding. They learned each other's patience and limits, she with a tolerance for his occasional terrible flash of temper, where his past felt nearer than the present, he with a tolerance for her insistence on slow justice. Their love, such as it was, formed in the gaps between shadow and work. Silas admired how Morningstar demanded evidence and gave herself to causes that sought the good of many, and not only herself. She admired the way he used his throat to silence a lie and his hands to patch a wound. There was an erotic of respect, the thrill of being seen as someone of worth and not as someone to be owned. He asked permission to sit with her one evening on the roof while the moon was thin and the children slept, and when she nodded, he felt the world become possible in ways it had not been for years. They planned together like two competent minds. Silas would handle the nighttime errands, moving seed stock to safe houses, forging signatures where necessary but always in the direction of restoring stolen items. Morningstar would handle the public face, She would run the co-op, hold the midwife clinic, and teach a new generation of women to keep their records. They would recruit allies from nearby towns and from a cadre of women who had quietly longed for real change. Women withheld by the fear of male response would find a place in Morningstar's cooperative and leave with knowledge that kept them fed and safe. Other women joined. An Irish widow who had a voice like a horn, an escaped laundress with a ledger skill, a native woman from a neighboring band with knowledge of winter storage methods. They pooled their skills and slowly built a small economic autonomy under the shadow of an uncertain law. Silas used his smarts to keep them under the radar where needed, and to expose the men when necessary. The partnership bloomed because each felt seen and needed within it. At a public meeting meant to shame the women into leaving, Morningstar stood with their ledger in her hand and spoke plainly. She did not beg. She offered evidence and the clear moral logic of their work. The town listened, and some listened with surprise because they had not known what women could do beyond the roles assigned. A few men in the audience shifted like guilty things. They had been counting on the women to fold, and they had miscalculated. Silas sat quiet at the back, but when a man in the crowd called the women thieves, the outlaw's hand did not give him license to strike. Instead, he stood and testified, not as a man who would claim her, but as a man who would attest to the truth because it was true. That day, a new register formed. They set up an office across the town square under the pretext of a health and trade hub. It wasn't large, but it had a table and a ledger, and most importantly, a legal name. They began to take in small fees for midwifery, accept seed and barter, and keep records that would make any opportunistic paper buyer think twice. The co-op was more resilient because it was transparent. Men like Hale required scandal to act. Facts made their carnage less tidy. Silas learned it was a different kind of bravery to stand in daylight and answer to the townsmen's questions honestly. He answered them with straightforwardness, with no flourish, using the quiet of an outlaw who had chosen to lay down his stealing for honest cunning. The townspeople watched him shift from a specter in stories to a man who stood and faced consequences. This mattered to Morningstar because she had never wanted to be the only iron in a hand. She wanted a partner who could be accountable. She wanted a man who could hold herself up when she was weary and who would not expect her to lay down her dreams. They were equal in the plan. She never relinquished decision-making. He never attempted to claim her authority. That mutual respect solidified their bond into something that promised not to be transient. It also made them strong. When the men plotted a dirty trick to embarrass Morningstar in public, Silas and the women's organized testimony preempted them, revealing the plot and forcing the men into the shame of being seen. The victory wasn't glory. It was the slow, consistent wearing away of a corrupt structure until there was nothing left to hold it. There came a moment not unlike the pause before a storm where Morningstar had to choose her terms. She had, for months, been balancing the immediate necessities of survival against the long game of justice. She had to decide whether to call the town to a public confrontation that would either force the hand of the county or bring down retribution. She could choose to run, gather the women, the elderly, the seeds, and travel to a place where the reservation's reach was less certain. Or she could stand, fight the legal fight, and risk the women and children in the face of men who had proven they would not hesitate to hurt. She lay awake that night and thought of the river as it had been when she was a girl, full and slow and giving. She thought of her father's hands guiding hers over a mortar as they pulverized bark into medicine. She thought of the way her husband had laughed once, before life had hardened the world into something small and mean. There were reasons to leave: the preservation of life, the practical safety of moving to a place where they might start over with less interference. There were reasons to stay, to make a stand for those who would come after them, to hold a place that had value beyond bricks and soil. Silas offered what he had learned. "We can run and be safe," he said softly, "but the men will find us in time. Running is a life of vigilance. Standing is a life of risk, but it's a life where you can look out and see what you made." He never tried to make the decision for her. He placed the choice back in her hands like the offering of a weapon she had the right to accept or refuse. For a brief moment, Morningstar allowed herself to imagine a life with lesser hurt. A little patch of land in the next valley where they could keep the co-op and the clinic, but away from the county's watchful eyes. She knew Silas had dreamed of that too. They spoke of it, the two of them, of a kitchen where bread rose like soft gold, and where women came to be healed and then left with their confidence restored. But then she thought of the families who could not leave, the old who had never learned to pack, the families whose histories were stitched to the ridge, the women who had no savings to make a safer path. She knew leaving would be an abdication for them. Her decision came not as a flourish, but as a quiet commitment. She chose to make a stand that would be worth the risk. Standing was not about heroics. It was a calculated choice to push back where the cost-benefit made sense. She would fight for the land while securing escape routes in case the fight went badly. This dual plan was her genius. Never lock the door without keeping a ladder. She liked the metaphor. She also liked the mathematics of survival. In the week before the showdown, Morningstar and Silas paused for a few hours of a rare domestic peace. They walked by the river, the water low but still singing, and for the first time in months they allowed themselves imagined futures. They spoke of a home that would be hers and his in equal measure, where her clinic fronted the road and his knowledge made the back safe. They did not promise marriage in saccharine ways. They promised partnership, to show up for each other, to be accountable to the good they built. It was a compact between two adults who had already chosen the other's worth. There was a small, tremulous happiness between them, as if the world had allowed them to breathe for a moment. Morningstar's plan crystallized into a bold legal and public strategy. They would challenge the county's claim in public and create simultaneous pressure by sending evidence to newspapers in the neighboring towns. They would have witnesses ready and the co-op's ledger to show the economic reality versus the speculators' lies. They would not be naive. They had contingency plans in the event of violence. Silas had arranged safe houses along the trail. A few trusted riders would shepherd the elderly if necessary. The choice was hers, and she made it with a clear mind. Stand and make the battle worth the women who depended on them. The calm before the storm came with improbable joy. At a small supper, the women sang old songs that put courage in their breasts. The children played with wooden horses and made dust angels on the floorboards. For one night, the house smelled only of bread and smoke and the possibility of sustained life. Silas took Morningstar's hand in the dim light, and their palms told each other what words had not yet dared. He would stand with her. She would not ask him to become less than himself, nor would she allow his past to be an excuse. They were a unit of equals, bound by choice. The threats gathered, like wolves circling. Hale and his men smelled their own jeopardy and moved quicker. They had money and lawyers who understood how to weaponize the law. But Morningstar had something they could not quantify: a community's quiet dignity, documents that would embarrass the county, and the respect of a woman who had learned to assemble a plan from small truths. She had also, in Silas, an ally who could navigate the night. The choice had been made, and they would now live with the consequences. When the forces turned, they did so in multiples. It was as if those who had profited for years decided to act with the coordinated cruelty of a hive. Men who had the law on contracts and a sheriff with a place in their pocket gathered like a storm. They pressed for injunctions, claimed that Morningstar's co-op was a subterfuge, demanded lists of members, and sought to subpoena them for questioning. Hale and his partner, a man named Bruner, put pressure not only on legal fronts but economic ones. They called in loans, intimidated creditors, claimed tax arrears. The co-op's bank line was threatened, and many small vendors were warned that trading with Morningstar could close their accounts. Silas's past hovered like a specter, not because he had done anything new, but because men like Hale knew an old scar could be used as a cudgel. They resurrected stories of train robberies and whispered them to the magistrate. They made it seem as if the co-op had flourishes of theft in its ledger. It was a slander campaign. It was the oldest tactic in the book. Morningstar expected it. Expectation did not make it less hateful. Worse, the men of the town used private threats. Brunner took matters into his own hands and sent 2 gunslingers to break a window one night, a message of intimidation. The women repaired the window and told each other through smiles that the sound had not frightened them. The sheriff, who owed money to the town's patriarchs, increased patrols near the co-op and would come by with questions that required records to be displayed, and once, a humiliating search of some of the women's boxes. The act of invasion felt like a cruelty aimed at dignity. Morningstar wrote it in the ledger as a thing to count and to be used against them at the right time. Silas's old associates began sniffing around again. Some came with offers, money in exchange for information or freedom if he betrayed the women. Others came because they'd heard a rumor and were looking for a handout. Silas's old life was not a simple enemy they could walk away from. It had roots, and those roots sent up shoots of temptation. But he had been taught by Morningstar's own unyielding ethics. He refused, even when friends he once ran with were in chains. He had a new allegiance now, not to himself alone, but to the collective the women had built. The reservation agents increased their pressure too. The government's machinery, hungry for neatness and fewer complicated claims, sent emissaries to encourage people to move for their own good. Morningstar refused to be patronized by the same men whose companies profited from land being market-ready. She stood firm, and the agents responded with paperwork that made legal strangulation possible. The co-op had to move quickly and create legal challenges in multiple jurisdictions, which drained resources and required more evidence than they had. There were betrayals too. A woman in their circle, frightened by threats to her child, signed a statement under pressure that implicated Morningstar in a minor wrongdoing. The man's argument was coercion. The betrayal stung like a cut that would not close. Morningstar felt the betrayal acutely because she had always tried to keep the circle safe enough to avoid precisely this kind of fracturing. But she had learned to accept the fact that people under pressure make desperate choices. She did not punish the woman publicly. Instead, she rebuilt trust where possible and moved resources to protect the most vulnerable. The worst days were those when the tactics turned crueler and personal. There was a night when the men burned part of the barn that housed stored grain. Not all of it was destroyed, but the message was clear. The co-op's economic margins thinned. Panic fluttered across the women's faces like a bird trying to find a place to land. Silas was vicious in his anger then. He wanted retribution more than strategy. Morningstar pulled him back as gently as one would pull a child from a fire. "Save your fury for the shape of the plan," she said. "Don't let them make you them." That command saved them both from doing something that might have shattered their moral advantage. As the forces conspired, Morningstar's strategy deepened. They decided to take the fight to the papers and to neighboring towns' public opinion. They produced evidence showing the men's collusion, stamped receipts, forged signatures traced back to the same clerk's ink, and testimony from workers who had been paid off. They started sending their documents to sympathetic journalists and to a philanthropic woman in the city who had the habit of funding legal challenges. Hale's reputation, once a mantle of respectability, began to crack. It was not enough to stop the men immediately, but it created leverage. The men who had built themselves on secrecy and quiet bribes found themselves on shaky ground. Silas's faithful network of allies, men and women who still owed him for past kindnesses, or who had seen a side of him that the rumor mills did not, dogged Hale's men. They intercepted shipments and offered their testimonies. The fight became a web of small strikes and counters. The co-op's records were their armor and their argument. Morningstar kept the ledger like a priest keeps a sacred text. Every entry was a prayer for survival. If any war has a moment called the darkest hour, this was it for Morningstar. The pressure came to a head on a morning thick with fog, when the sheriff, leaning on a court order, sent men to arrest two of the main women organizers on charges of inciting a riot. It was a ridiculous charge. Their riot had been a public meeting, but the charge fit the strategy of the men who wanted their movement stifled by legal entanglement. The women were dragged from their beds while Rose's child watched from under the kitchen table. The sight would not leave Morningstar for days. Morningstar's instinct was to fight, but the fight she needed to win required cool thinking. Bruner had leveraged the courts and had friends in places where money bought quick results. They could turn a simple hearing into a long process of fines and legal logjams that would bleed the co-op of money. The worst-case scenario would be imprisonment for the women that might destroy the co-op's leadership. It would be a mortal blow to the plan they'd nurtured. Silas reacted like a man who had been forced to learn patience too quickly. He wanted to storm the jail and drag the women from their cells. He wanted the old justice of the road, black and violent and satisfying. Morningstar stopped him. "We do not save ourselves by becoming what we fight," she told him. Her voice did not waver. It had the iron edge of a woman who had chosen a measured path. "You saved us from blood once. Save us now from ruin." She went to the county judge with her papers. She spoke with a clarity that demanded hearing. She presented witnesses and receipts and petitions. Some of the judge's colleagues were uncomfortable with a woman who refused to be quiet. The judge, a calculating man with a fondness for a teacup and a place in the newspaper's society column, surprised them with an order for release on bail. It was not a victory, it was a reprieve. However, the reprieve had a cost. The co-op's funds were depleted to pay fines and bail. Worse, Brunner had convinced certain men that a different kind of action would end the problem once and for all. They carried letters of private menace and a few men with guns to the co-op at night. When the two groups met, violence erupted. Guns were fired into the air. The sharp smell of cordite filled the air as mothers dragged children away. Someone was hit in the foot, another in the shoulder. It was chaos the sort of men wanted, a scene to present in court as a justification for more crackdown. In the melee, Morningstar found herself praying in a quiet voice she rarely used. She watched Silas move like a man who had finally learned where his anger would be useful, not to kill, but to protect a woman's body from being preyed upon. He carried a child out of the way when the noise rose to an unbearable pitch. The women stood like a ring around their wounded, singing old songs. The old Cora's voice cut through the chaos and steadied them like a steady hand on a fevered brow. After the shooting, the co-op was a wound that throbbed. The men who had started the fight had vanished into the night. News reporters came and took notes and wrote about a scuffle and lawless women, as if it were a simple moral equation. Morningstar sat with the wounded and thought of every possible future. She did not allow herself to break into tears in public. There was no time for spectacle. She organized the tending of injured shoulders and the tallying of missing supplies. She summoned Silas to her side and looked at him in the raw light of truth. If they did not win the legal fight now, they would not have the capacity to survive the winter. They might have to run. It was a test that reached into the marrow of her determination. She had decided to face the men and keep the land, but the cost became brutally apparent. Her choice, that had felt noble, now showed its price. Women cried that night under blankets and told stories to steady themselves. Morningstar listened and answered with a plan more radical than before. They would not simply survive. They would make the corruption public to such an extent that the men's own reputations could not withstand the glare. She arranged for letters to be sent to the state's capital and for witnesses to come forward with affidavits prepared with the help of a lawyer in a distant town. It was a gamble. It required bravery in the face of danger and faith in the wider public's appetite for justice. Silas, watching her, realized the depth of what she had made him feel, the need to be measured and brave at the same time. He had always thought he understood courage. He had not known the particular kind of courage that had patience and bite. He had not understood how much it cost a woman like Morningstar to keep her heart open while being threatened. He promised to be steady. He promised, too, that no one who had stood with her would be left alone. The darkest hour was not a single event, but a grinding test of will. They had lost supplies. They had been shot at. They had watched the jail doors close on kin, but they also had the co-op's ledger and a group of women who would not be erased. In the quiet after the guns, Morningstar stood at the head of her table and called for a new list of duties. "We rebuild," she said. It was a command and a comfort. The women rose to it like a tide. When the call came from the ally in the city, a woman who ran a small newspaper sympathetic to rural injustices, it was like the first light after a long night. She wrote that the allegations had been printed and that the state's attorney had taken notice. The hearing in the neighboring county that Morningstar had petitioned for was scheduled. The court would receive sworn affidavits and ledgers and witness testimony. For the first time since the beginnings of the fight, Morningstar felt a possibility open, like a road wide enough for a wagon. She organized with surgical precision. Witnesses were coached to speak with clarity. Ledgers were cross-examined and notarized. Silas and a small band of loyal allies took on the responsibility of protecting those who would testify, arranging safe houses and routes that would not involve the county roads. They practiced the simple civic ritual of showing up together, standing in a courthouse and telling the truth. For women unused to civic power, it felt like stepping into a bright, blinding place. On the day of the hearing, Morningstar wore the dress of a woman who had been through hard winters and came out with a head held high. It was not a dress to court attention, but one to command credibility. She led her witnesses, and when she spoke, she did so with the slow cadence of someone addressing a jury and a people rather than pleading to a judge who might be bought. She told the story of the ledger, of the nights that had been burned, the seeds stolen, the women fined. She told of the county men who thought themselves beyond reproach. Her voice did not tremble. It carried the kind of moral pressure a room can feel when truth is spoken with a practiced hand. Silas waited outside the courthouse doors like a sentinel, his jaw set. He had done everything he could in the weeks prior to make sure the women could speak. He had found men who would testify to seeing Brunner in the barn the night of the fire. He had waylaid smugglers who had once stolen from the co-op and made them confess. All of that work culminated in a day of spoken truth. The county had to respond. It was not an instant victory. The men with money hired lawyers who made glittering arguments about order and contracts. But the press had run Morningstar's side, and citizens from neighboring towns had come with their own stories of similar treatment. The state's attorney, who had grown tired of the county's small-town corruption stories, took the county to task. The hearing resulted in an order for investigations into Brunner and Hale. Their assets were frozen temporarily as an inquiry was put on the docket. It was the sort of squeaky wheel noise that could lead to something durable. Triumph, when it came, was not theatrical. It was the small joys of justice. The co-op's funds being returned, the stolen ledger recovered, the notice that bail was no longer demanded. The sheriff, who had been complicit, was replaced by a man from the state who had a record of fairness. The women danced in the kitchen like they had no reason to be embarrassed by happiness anymore. Morningstar sat on the stoop and watched the sun set over the valley and felt the first hush of tiredness that was not worry. The battle had worn her down and made something else in her. She rose in public as a leader. She changed the way women in neighboring valleys saw their own lives. They wrote to Morningstar, asking how she had gotten the men to listen, how she had got the papers to print their stories. She told them the truth. It was not about loudness or theatricality. It was about evidence, courage, and the stubbornness to keep showing up. In the aftermath, a small group of women, a handful at first, then more as word spread, traveled to Morningstar to learn the cooperative model. They sat in the kitchen and learned how to keep ledgers, how to prepare salves, how to register births and names, the small civil acts that secured dignity. Morningstar taught not only medicine, but bookkeeping. She taught women how to make small claims that would stand up to scrutiny. Slowly, she built a network of women who could protect themselves from the predations of men with paperwork. Other women joined the fight in sisterhood. They shared skills and pooled resources, the way women have done always. Morningstar watched the shape of her community change from a fragile refuge into a resilient network. She felt the surging pride of someone who had not only kept her home, but had made it a place of stability for others. Silas's redemption was intertwined with the women's successes. He had been part of the dirty past. Now he started a legitimate trade, mapping trails for small farmers to take their goods to market safely. He hired on as a practical logistics man for the co-op's deliveries. He and Morningstar arranged the co-op's ledger together, as equals. Love was not the story's main currency, but it had its honest place. They sat sometimes at night and made plans for a future together that did not require the tossing of old lives like coin. The final legal motions took months, but the momentum Morningstar had created grew like a winter sun, low but steady, impossible to ignore. Bruner and Hale were indicted for collusion and minor arson for the barn burning. The state's attorney presented the co-op's ledger and witnesses who testified to the long pattern of theft and intimidation. Under cross-examination, the men who had once held the county's strings faltered. The ledger was not just numbers. It was proof that the women's labor had been real and valuable. The testimony showed patterns of bribes and collusion. The jury, a strange and small miracle, listened. When the verdict was read, the women stood in the courtroom like a row of trees finally bearing fruit. The judge declared in a tone that made certain men blanch. The evidence shows attempts to coerce, to force, and to profit on the misfortune of those unable to defend themselves. Brunner was found guilty of conspiracy in the barn burning and fined. Hale faced charges that made him a pariah in other towns whose papers had picked up the story. Their power, which had been built on quiet deals and the fear of messy publicity, unraveled. The women celebrated in the co-op with a bread that rose high and sharp. For all the damage done, their victory was not just theirs. It was a precedent. But the victory's most substantial part was not only legal vindication. The co-op began to function openly and prosper. They applied for a small grant with the help of city allies to expand their clinic into a place that could serve the surrounding rural areas. Morningstar converted a part of her land into a teaching garden where the women could teach seedlings the right conditions and share the methods of medicine that had once been kept as secret by necessity. They published a small pamphlet on herbal practices and safe midwifery. It was modest, but empowering. Silas stood beside her in the new clinic's doorway when the ribbon was cut, not as a man owning the building, but as a partner. He had reservations about being in the public eye still, but he kept silent because Morningstar's presence was what mattered. The town had changed. New men had taken the sheriff's place, and some old alliances had fractured. The state had a better ear for the complaints of women. Their victory was not complete. Some enemies still lingered, but they had bought time and dignity. In the weeks that followed, Morningstar and Silas found their rhythm in a life shaped by mutual respect. There were mornings when they worked the garden together and evenings when they read to each other by the stove. Silas still had moments when his old life haunted his steps, but she reminded him gently, "We are building." He kept a ledger too, the one that tracked deliveries and departures and the favors owed. He kept it carefully, as if he could atone in numbers. Female solidarity became more than a nice sentiment. Other women who had watched the co-op's triumph came seeking advice and skills. Morningstar taught classes in herb drying and signaling for help. She taught not only medical practices, but also how to hold a community together, how to record births, how to insist on people's names being spelled correctly in official books, how to press the law when necessary. Women who had once thought of themselves as small now learned to be procedural and powerful. On a calm summer afternoon, they welcomed other enthusiasts to a fair, a small gathering where trade booths displayed cured meats and bread, where the school's children performed, where the women's co-op sold its salves and seed packets. It was a public proof of what they'd built. There was dancing with a music box playing a tune that sounded old and hopeful. Men who had opposed them watched, perhaps for the first time, as a community they had tried to engineer, out of being a place of profit, became something resilient and beautiful. Morningstar's transformation was now visible not only in her ledger, but in the expressions of other women who came seeking advice. She had gone from grieving widow to community leader, from a woman targeted by a county order to a woman whose presence in the valley could not be erased. She had become a force that could write her future. The romance with Silas matured into a partnership of equals. They married, quietly, not for show, but for the practical vow of mutual care. The ceremony was simple and dignified, attended by the women who had been their anchors. No man claimed her. She claimed herself and chose him. Years later, the valley looked like a place that had been stubbornly defended. The cottonwoods had not been cut down. The clinic had expanded into a low, bright building with windows that opened to a garden of medicinal plants. A small sign, painted by Rosa's careful hand, read, "Morning Star Healing and Trade." There was now a ledger room that doubled as a learning center where women from other valleys came to learn bookkeeping, seed saving, and legal strategies. Morning Star had established a small trust fund. The co-op's profits went first to the care of the elderly, the education of girls, and to a rotating legal fund that helped towns too afraid to fight for their rights. Her clothes had kept the traces of utility but had taken on a new quality. An apron of embroidered flowers that represented the women who had shown up in storms, and a necklace with a rattle still tied in the leather, not as a relic but as a symbol of work. Her hair was threaded with streaks of silver now, and she wore it braided high as a woman who was part elder and part mother. Her posture had the relaxed strength of someone who has lived through hard things and come to the other side with a clear conscience. Silas had found in the years a new role, not as a lawless man, but as an organizer of logistics for a network of women traders who needed secure routes. He had built a small stable and hired a few men who had once been in gray areas of the law but now worked for honest coin. They respected him because he respected the work and paid fairly. He kept his hands clean in a way he had never managed for himself before. They had no children of their own, by choice and circumstance, but they had a yard full of the village's children who came to learn planting, to take home salves, and to be bandaged when scraped knees happened. Morning Star took them under her wing in the way a teacher does, patient, firm, and full of lessons that would serve them beyond the valley. The school teacher Mary had become the principal of a modest school, where girls and boys received lessons that were balanced: arithmetic and story, herb lore and civic duty. Female solidarity had become institutionalized. The cooperative had inspired similar efforts in other valleys. Letters came weekly from women who had organized their own midwifery funds and legal directories. Morning Star answered every letter with advice and a recipe, and sometimes a small packet of seeds. Her hair grew silver, and her face garnered laugh lines that spoke of hard work and humor not yet surrendered. The men like Hale had faded into the back of newspapers that were interested in other scandals. Bruner had left the state until his name lost its weight. The legal precedents set by Morning Star and her co-op were small and local, but mattered. They demonstrated that a group of women, organized and persistent, could make it costly and slow for predatory men to take what they wanted. It had nothing to do with romantic tales of single-handed vengeance, and everything to do with the unglamorous act of record-keeping, the slow work of accountability. Morning Star liked to say that records were the skeleton of justice. They were not flashy, but they held up the body. Appearance matters little in the end, but there is a kind of visual truth to transformation that felt satisfying. Morning Star's clothes no longer hid grief as they once had. They celebrated a woman who loved her work. Morning Star and Silas often walked the ridge together, not as a man who had rescued a woman, but as two people who had chosen each other in the wake of rearranged lives. He respected her fiercely, and she trusted him. Neither sought to own the other. Their romance was mature, deep, honest affection paired with a shared mission. Their nights were full of the quiet contentment that comes from a day well spent. On a late autumn afternoon when the light slanted low as if set on amber, a group of women from a neighboring valley arrived. They had come to learn the cooperative model and mostly to find inspiration. Morning Star greeted them at the gate. They wore faces hardened by similar storms, and she took their hands and brought them inside. They listened as she taught them legal tricks, what to look for in suspicious land deals, how to track payments, how to create community pressure through public writing. She gave them seeds and recipes, and finally, a history of the little things that had saved a place. The ability to make bread, to keep records, to call the press, and to teach each other. Morning Star stood in the doorway, the wind lifting her braid, the rattle on her neck catching a thin sound. She looked at the women, at their hands that would hold the future, and felt the deep satisfaction of a life remade. She had been left for dead, in a manner of speaking, by systems of law and men with appetites. She had, with her hands and her chosen allies, sewn her life back to something stronger. She had trusted herself, taught other women to trust themselves, and shaped a valley that would outlast rumors and men thirsty for land. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you've found your tribe. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings. Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms. Share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister, because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are.